I am sitting here watching something absolutely extraordinary unfold in real time. Not in some obscure corner of the world, not in a country most people can't find on a map. This is happening in the parliaments of our closest allies, in the boardrooms of the world's biggest pension funds, in the quiet phone calls between world leaders who have decided they are done waiting. 3 days ago, something happened in Canberra, Australia that should be the lead story on every major network. It isn't. And that silence is itself the story. Because what just took place between Canada and Australia doesn't just change the relationship between two countries, it changes the architecture of global power. And once you understand what was actually signed, what was actually said, and what is actually being built right now, you will never look at the phrase America first the same way again. In the next few minutes, I'm going to show you exactly what happened, who is behind it, why Trump is losing grip on the countries that were supposed to be his most loyal partners, and what it means for your economy, your supply chains, and the world you are going to wake up in 5 years from now. This is the Daily Brief. If you are not subscribed yet, do it right now, because this story is moving fast, and we are going to be tracking every development as it happens. Let's go back. Not years, not decades, just a few weeks. It started, as so many of these things do, with a speech. January 20th, 2026, the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, a stage that has hosted heads of state, central bank governors, and billionaires for 50 years. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney walked up to that podium and said something that hasn't been said from that stage in a very long time. He told the assembled financial and political elite of the world that the rules-based global order, the system built on American leadership after World War II, had experienced what he called a rupture, not a transition, a rupture. He said that great powers had begun using economic integration as weapons, tariffs as leverage, financial infrastructure as coercion, and supply chains as vulnerabilities to be exploited. He didn't name Donald Trump. He didn't have to. Every person in that room knew exactly who he was talking about. The reaction was immediate. Former Swedish Prime Minister Carl Bildt called it a vital and important message. Former UK Communications Director Alastair Campbell called it real leadership. Mexico's President Claudia Sheinbaum said it was in tune with the current times. And Donald Trump, speaking at the same forum the very next day, looked directly into the cameras and said, "Canada lives because of the United States. Remember that, Mark." That was January. That was the fuse being lit. Now let's fast forward to what happened this week. Because that Davos speech was the declaration, what happened in Australia was the construction. On March 5th, 2026, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney stood before both houses of the Australian Parliament in Canberra. This was the first time a Canadian Prime Minister had addressed the Australian Parliament in nearly 20 years. 226 MPs and senators were in attendance, nearly the entire Parliament. That is not a courtesy appearance. That is a signal. The two leaders greeted each other with a 19-gun salute and a military band playing "O Canada" outside Canberra's Parliament House. Carney then met with Albanese and his full cabinet before the speech as they considered new initiatives together. That is the kind of reception you give a head of state. That is the kind of reception you give someone you are betting your future on. And then Carney spoke. He told that parliament that the post-war global order is breaking down. He told them that middle powers like Canada and Australia face a fundamental choice. They can remain dependent on great powers who have proven themselves willing to use that dependency as a weapon. Or they can build something new. As reported by the Canberra Times, Carney told the assembled parliament directly, "Great powers can compel, but compulsion comes with cost, both reputational and financial. Middle powers must convene to matter, but not everyone can. In a post-rupture world, the nations that are trusted and can work together will be quicker to the punch, more effective in their responses, more proactive in shaping outcomes, and ultimately more secure and prosperous." He said Canada's strategic imperative is to build sovereign capabilities in critical sectors at home and abroad by convening coalitions with trusted, reliable partners like Australia to ensure that integration is never again a source of subordination. Pause on that word, subordination. He is telling the Australian Parliament that being too dependent on any single great power is a national security risk. He is not speaking in the abstract. He is speaking from experience. Subscribe to the Daily Brief if you are watching this for the first time, because what I'm about to walk you through is the deepest breakdown of this story you will find anywhere, and you are going to want to follow it all the way to the end. Let's talk about what was actually signed in Canberra. Because the speech was powerful, the agreements are historic. Announcement number 1. Australia joins Canada's Critical Minerals Production Alliance. This is the one that should make Washington lose sleep. According to the joint statement published by the Canadian Prime Minister's office on March 5th, Australia has formally joined Canada's Critical Minerals Production Alliance. The two leaders also announced a new clean energy partnership and a memorandum of understanding on AI safety. Read that again. Australia joining Canada's Critical Minerals Alliance. Think about what that means geographically. Canada sits on some of the world's largest deposits of lithium, uranium, potash, cobalt, and rare earth elements. Australia sits on some of the world's largest deposits of uranium, lithium, and gold. Combined, this is not a partnership. This is the foundation of a resource superpower. As Carney said at the joint press conference, Canada and Australia are working together to build what he described as the largest mineral reserve held by trusted democratic nations. Think about what depends on these minerals: electric vehicle batteries, semiconductors, advanced defense systems, the next generation of AI hardware, the fertilizer that feeds much of the developing world. All of it runs on what Canada and Australia together are now choosing to control and co-develop. As reported by the Canberra Times, Carney specifically said the next generation of drones, surveillance aircraft, cyber, and AI are being created in Adelaide and Alberta. He is not talking about the future. He is talking about the present, and he is deliberately linking Australia's defense industrial base to Canada's rather than defaulting entirely to the American one. That is announcement number one. Received. Announcement number two. The money has already started moving. This one hits differently because it is not about future intentions. It is about capital that has already changed hands. According to the joint statement from both prime ministers, the Canada-Australia tax treaty is being modernized to facilitate greater investment, including joint investments in nation-building projects in both countries, with both governments committing to prioritize those negotiations. But here is where it gets concrete. A memorandum of understanding was signed between Industry Funds Management, Canadian pension funds, and Australian superannuation funds in Sydney on March 4th. A senior delegation of Australian superannuation funds was invited to visit Canada in 2026. This is institutional capital, pension money, the retirement savings of millions of Canadian and Australian workers being aligned and directed toward joint infrastructure and clean energy investments. According to Canadian government figures, Canadian direct investment in Australia already stands at $58.8 billion as of 2024. Bilateral merchandise trade totaled $6.1 billion that same year. These are not insignificant numbers, and they are about to grow substantially. The Business Council of Australia and the Business Council of Canada also signed their own MOU on March 5th to facilitate greater trade and investment and enable meaningful business leader engagement. When the business councils of two countries sign formal agreements, that is not symbolic. That is the private sector receiving a clear signal from their governments. The direction has been set. Now go build. That is announcement number two. Received. Announcement number three. And this one nobody is talking about enough, the Kanzuk signal. According to analysis published by Kanzuk International, this visit marks a significant and crucial step toward deeper ties in diplomacy, trade, defense, and mobility among Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the United Kingdom. Carney's Australian visit was the second stop on a 10-day diplomatic tour that included India and Japan. India, the world's fastest-growing major economy. Japan, one of the world's most advanced industrial powers. Australia, one of the world's richest resource nations. This is not random scheduling. According to the joint statement from both prime ministers, Canada, Australia, and India are all members of the Australia-Canada-India Technology and Innovation Partnership. The AI ministers of all three countries met on the margins of the AI Summit in New Delhi just weeks ago. They agreed to develop a joint work plan to advance practical trilateral cooperation in artificial intelligence and digital technologies. And according to analysis from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace published this week, the CPTPP, which now includes 12 countries and which the United States abandoned under Trump in 2017, is already in discussions with the European Union about aligning trade rules. In February, Carney told reporters that Canada can play a role in building a bridge between the EU and CPTPP blocs. He is not talking about a trade deal. He is talking about a new architecture, a system where the rules are written by the countries that kept their word. And when Carney addressed the Australian Parliament, he cited the recent trilateral with UK Prime Minister Starmer as a time of great consequence. He mentioned the Commonwealth. He mentioned shared values, shared institutions, and shared democratic foundations. The UK is watching, and the domino that follows could reshape the entire Anglosphere. That is announcement number 3, received. Before we go further, hit that like button if this analysis is landing for you. It genuinely helps the Daily Brief reach more people who are trying to understand what is really happening in the world. And drop a comment. Tell me whether you think this is a permanent realignment or a temporary reaction. Because the answer to that question determines everything about where this goes. Now let's talk about Washington, because while Carney was in Canberra receiving a 19-gun salute, something else was happening back across the Pacific. The pattern of American pressure on both countries is now fully documented. In January, after the Davos speech, Trump publicly told Carney to remember that Canada lives because of the United States. He then threatened to impose 100% tariffs on Canadian exports if Canada proceeded with any deal involving China, despite having called Canada's preliminary agreement with China a good thing just days prior. He disinvited Canada from his Board of Peace. He repeatedly referred to the Canadian Prime Minister as a governor of the 51st state and slapped tariffs on its exports. U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent then publicly claimed Carney had aggressively walked back parts of his Davos speech in a private phone call with Trump. Carney walked directly to the microphones on Parliament Hill and said he had been absolutely clear with the president. He meant what he said in Davos. No retraction, no backpedaling, nothing. Now look at the Australia angle. As analyzed by scholars writing in The Conversation this week, Trump's escalating trade policies and erratic shifts have raised a fundamental question about what the alternative to American-led order actually looks like. And the weakest link in the U.S.-Australia alliance is not American military capability, it is American reliability. Deterrence depends on confidence that commitments will be honored. When U.S. policy becomes more transactional and less predictable, that confidence weakens. Even if the underlying military power remains formidable, the alliance erodes. Australia has decided to reduce that exposure, not abandon the alliance, reduce the exposure. And the way you reduce exposure is by building alternatives. That is exactly what the Carney-Albanese summit was, a hedge, a very large, very expensive, very deliberate hedge. And then there is Congress, because even inside the United States, the walls are moving. As reported in February 2026, the House of Representatives voted 219 to 211 to push back against Trump's tariffs on Canada. In a chamber controlled by Republicans, it was largely symbolic, but 219 votes against the president on his signature economic policy is not nothing. That is, Republican lawmakers in districts that depend on cross-border trade looking at their constituents and deciding the tariffs are a problem. According to CNBC, Canadian bookings at U.S. mountain destinations sank more than 45% in January 2026 compared to the same month the previous year. Canadian hockey teams are sitting out tournaments at U.S. resorts. Canadians who used to vacation in Florida and Arizona are going to Costa Rica instead. According to polling firm Leger, the biggest surprise is how adamant Canadians are about not supporting the USA in any shape or fashion. Their behavior is not softening, it is hardening. And the U.S. businesses that depend on those Canadian dollars are noticing. This is what economic separation looks like in practice. Not a wall, not a declaration, just people changing their habits permanently. Now let's zoom in on Carney himself, because you cannot fully understand this moment without understanding the man designing it. Here is what most coverage misses. Mark Carney is not a politician who became a leader. He is a central banker who entered politics with a specific theory of power. He was governor of the Bank of Canada from 2008 to 2013, then governor of the Bank of England from 2013 to 2020, steering the UK economy through the most turbulent phase of Brexit negotiations. He has sat in rooms where global financial architecture is designed. He has negotiated with sovereign wealth funds, with the IMF, with the ECB. He understands how capital flows. He understands how dependency is engineered and how it is escaped. When he talks about economic integration as a weapon, he is not speaking in metaphor. He is describing a mechanism he has watched operate from the inside. And when he builds this middle power coalition, he is not building it as a political project. He is building it as a financial architecture, an alternative plumbing system for the global economy, one that doesn't require Washington to approve every transaction. According to CBC News, the personal connection between Carney and Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese began at Pope Francis's funeral in Rome last year and has deepened through dozens of calls and bilateral meetings at international summits since. Australia's opposition leader Angus Taylor, a close personal friend of Carney's who attended postgraduate studies at Oxford University with him, called Carney at the parliamentary address a man of the highest caliber and said simply, "In this brave new world, we must work together." That is not partisan politics. That is a country's entire political establishment agreeing that the direction is correct. Carney personally drafted a social media post after meeting Albanese, an unusual gesture for a sitting prime minister, describing him as the only world leader who could discuss spirituality, the global economy, Vegemite hygiene, and how a Eurovision act was robbed in a single conversation. That kind of connection is not diplomatic theater. It is the foundation of trust. And trust, as Carney keeps repeating, is now a strategic asset. Trump demands loyalty. Carney builds trust. Trump creates dependency. Carney creates architecture. Trump uses fear. Carney offers value. When you are designing a system to function without American permission, you need partners who trust each other enough to sign binding agreements, invest pension capital, and align defense procurement. You do not build that with threats. You build it with exactly what Carney has been doing since he took office in March 2025. Now let's bring this down to what it means for you. The American dollar's global dominance is not a law of nature. It is a function of trust. It exists because when countries wanted to do business, they needed dollars. They needed access to American markets, American banks, American financial infrastructure. When that reliability is questioned, capital looks for alternatives. We are already seeing it. A Canada-Australia resource and technology bloc backed by aligned pension capital and a modernized bilateral tax treaty is a circuit that begins to bypass certain American financial choke points. Not entirely, not yet, but directionally. And direction is everything in economics. According to the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, companies have been pausing investments and supply chains are being redesigned as countries aim to reduce their vulnerability to coercion from any single great power. Uncertainty is a tax. It gets priced into every investment decision, every factory location, every supply chain design. If you manufacture electronics in the United States and you cannot reliably source lithium from Canada or uranium from Australia at predictable prices, you have a structural problem. You do not solve that by waiting for Washington's mood to stabilize. You solve it by finding alternative supply chains. And those alternative supply chains are being built right now in Canberra, in New Delhi, in Tokyo, in Brussels. Canada holds the world's third largest uranium reserves. Australia holds the world's largest. Canada is the world's largest producer of potash, the essential ingredient in fertilizer that grows much of the planet's food. Australia is the world's largest exporter of coal and one of the largest exporters of iron ore. Together, under a coordinated resource policy, an aligned AI development strategy, and an integrated defense procurement system, they represent not a military challenge to American power. They represent something more uncomfortable: substitution. They are building a world where, for a growing number of critical transactions, you do not need American intermediation, and the consequences for ordinary people are already beginning to arrive. If these resource blocks prioritize each other over the United States, if their pension funds invest in projects that deliberately build alternative supply chains, if their technology companies co-develop AI architectures that are licensed to each other and not to American firms by default, then the cost of doing business inside the United States goes up. The cost of the components in your phone, the cost of the battery in your electric vehicle, the cost of the fertilizer used to grow the food on your table, the cost of the semiconductors that every modern machine now depends on. These are not abstract concerns. They are already being priced into forward contracts and investment models by people who manage hundreds of billions of dollars and cannot afford to wait for political clarity that may never come. Let me tell you what I cannot get out of my head from this week. Carney told the Australian Parliament that Canada and Australia look to different skies. Canada sees the North Star. Australia sees the Southern Cross. But he told that chamber, we have the same orientation. That is not diplomatic poetry. As he put it before that parliament, the institutional depth they share, their friendship forged by shared values and common battles, creates a trust that is a strategic asset. He called it a rare convening power, a power that most countries simply cannot access because they have not earned the trust that makes it possible. Meanwhile, on the other side of the ledger, Trump was threatening 100% tariffs over a preliminary trade agreement, calling Canada among the worst in the world to deal with, referring to the Canadian Prime Minister as a governor, publicly insisting that Canada only exists because of the United States. That is not the language of an ally managing a disagreement. That is the language of a patron who has decided the client has no options. He was wrong. According to the Angus Reid Institute, polling confirms that Trump's 51st state rhetoric has produced unprecedented unity across Canada. Canada spent the last year showing exactly how wrong those assumptions were. India, Japan, Australia, Europe, the CPTPP, the Kanzuk Network, the G7 Critical Minerals Alliance, these are not consolation prizes. These are the foundations of a parallel global order being constructed in real time. Attendez, ce n'est pas fini. Because here is what makes this moment truly different from every previous diplomatic disagreement between allies and Washington. In past episodes, when a U.S. president got tough, allies complained, absorbed the pain, and waited for the next administration. They had no alternative. They needed American markets. They needed American security guarantees. They needed American financial infrastructure. The dependency was structural. What Carney is doing, and what the Canberra summit represents, is the first serious, well-financed, institutionally backed attempt to make that dependency optional. Not for everyone, not immediately, but for a growing coalition of countries that look like America, speak like America, and fought alongside America. The calculus is changing. The question is no longer whether they can survive without American approval. The question is whether they can build something better. And right now, the answer they are betting on is yes. So where does this go from here? I see three paths, no middle ground. Path number one, this accelerates. The UK is watching Canberra closely. New Zealand is watching. Japan, where Carney traveled after Australia, is watching. The EU and CPTPP countries already recognize the imperative of collective action and are beginning a process to share ideas and proposals for where to go from here. If that process crystallizes into a formal architecture, if Europe's industrial base aligns with the resource wealth of Canada and Australia and the technology capacity of Japan and India, what you have is not a challenge to American dominance. You have a replacement for the role America chose to vacate. That is path one. And based on what was signed in Canberra this week, it is further along than most people realize. Path number two, Trump escalates and the coalition faces its first real test. Australia cannot fully decouple from the United States. The AUKUS submarine deal, its forward defense posture in the Pacific, its intelligence infrastructure, all of it runs through Washington to a degree that cannot be unwound quickly. As noted by strategic analysts this week, nearly 80% of Canadian exports go to the U.S. That dependency is real and structural and cannot be resolved by a parliamentary address, however historic. If Trump responds to the Canberra summit by imposing punitive tariffs on Australian agricultural exports or by threatening to pull intelligence sharing under the Five Eyes arrangement, the coalition faces a genuine test. Would Australia hold? Would Canada's businesses facing 35% tariffs and the threat of more demand their government negotiate rather than build? These are the pressures that will define whether this moment becomes a turning point or a footnote. I think we are on path one, but I thought that 3 weeks ago too. And then another midnight tweet arrived. I want to leave you with the questions that matter. Is what Carney and Albanese are building genuinely a defense of the rules-based global order? Or is it the construction of a new regional bloc that simply excludes the U.S. rather than reforming it? The answer matters because the two things look similar from the outside but have very different long-term consequences for global stability. And underneath that, when Trump's term ends, will the architecture Carney is building be reversible? Will Canada and Australia and their growing circle of partners choose to reintegrate into an American-led system if Washington returns to reliability? Or will the new plumbing be so deeply embedded, the new supply chains so thoroughly rerouted, the new capital flows so permanently redirected that there is no going back? Because that is the real bet being made in Canberra this week. Not a bet against America. A bet that the world cannot afford to wait for America to decide what kind of country it wants to be. The old order is not coming back. Carney said it. Albanese repeated it. The question is not whether the world changes. The question is who gets to design what comes next. I want to hear from you. Do you think Australia made the right call in fully embracing Canada's coalition? Is Carney building a genuine alternative to American leadership, or is this a temporary reaction that collapses the moment Washington stabilizes? And the question underneath all of it, when the dust settles, which coalition will have built something that actually lasts? Leave your answer in the comments. I read every single one. If this analysis gave you something the mainstream news did not, hit the like button. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who are trying to understand what is actually happening in the world. Subscribe to the Daily Brief because this story is not over, not even close. Carney lands in Tokyo next. Japan is watching everything that happened in Canberra, and what happens in Tokyo will tell us whether this is the beginning of something historic or just the most consequential week in an already extraordinary year. Stay watching.